She came through the gates of Haramir with one bag, and no one troubled to open them for her, which told her plainly enough what sort of welcome she had bought herself with a stranger's letter and a dead man's name. Cora Aldridge set the bag down only long enough to shift its weight from one hand to the other, and did not set it down again until she reached the door. She would remember this walk longest afterward, though she did not know it yet, any more than she knew that a paper already existed, locked in a drawer not 40 yards from where she stood, with her name written upon it in a hand she had not yet learned to recognize by its slant alone. 2 grooms by the stable arch were not troubling to lower their voices. The steward's widow, one of them said, come creeping back after 5 years to see what she can still carry off, and the other laughed the short laugh of a man agreeing with something he has not troubled to examine. Cora did not turn her head. She had learned, in 5 years of being spoken of rather than 2, that the turning of a head cost more than it purchased. And she was a woman who kept close accounts of what things cost. Haramir itself rose up pale and long against a sky gone thick and yellow with the last heat of summer, and somewhere beyond the yew hedge a wren was singing as though the day owed it nothing at all. She would need every quarter day between now and Michaelmas to do what she had come to do, and Michaelmas was 10 weeks off, and the thought of it sat in her like a stone laid flat and cold beneath her ribs. Lady Honoria Vane had advertised for a companion who could also keep accounts, plainly, honestly, without asking to be paid a compliment for it, and Cora had written back the same day, before she could talk herself out of the risk of the name she still carried. She did not use Thomas's name in the letter. She had signed only C. Aldridge, and told herself that Haramir's new duke had been a boy at school when her husband was ruined and buried, too young and too far off to have troubled himself with the particulars of a land steward's disgrace, and that the name would mean nothing to him. She was wrong about very little in her life. She was wrong about that. The housekeeper who let her in was broad and brisk and smelled of beeswax and strong tea, and looked Cora over in the frank, unhurried way of a woman pricing a bolt of cloth. Well, you look as though you know which end of a broom is which is more than I can say for the last one. Come in before the heat gets in with you. It was in the hall, setting her bag down at last upon flags gone cool and dark with age, that Cora first saw him. He came down the staircase without hurry, a tall man in his shirt-sleeves, with ink upon 2 fingers of his right hand, and he stopped on the 4th step from the bottom when he saw her, the way a man stops when a sum he has been carrying in his head suddenly refuses to add. Mrs. Aldridge, he said, and it was not a question, though she had told no one yet that this was her name. Your Grace, she said, and set her chin the half-inch that was, for her, the whole of open defiance. He did not ask how he knew it. Neither did she ask why the not asking sat so strangely on his face, as though he had swallowed a name whole and was only now discovering its shape going down. He did not raise his voice. Not then, and not for a long while afterward. She would come to understand that he had never needed to, that the men who raised their voices in that house were, without exception, men she need not fear, because it was the still ones who could truly do her harm. Lady Honoria is expecting you, he said. She had the wit to expect you a fortnight ago, and I have only just been informed. That is not, he added, after a pause exactly as long as it needed to be, a complaint. She thought it very nearly was. He turned before she could decide, and went up again with the same unhurried step. It was the housekeeper, whose name was Mrs. Pruitt, who told her on the stairs that Michaelmas audit was the whole of the household's present religion, that the trustees came down from London on that day every year to see the estate's accounts laid out plain. and that this year, on account of debts nobody below stairs had the whole truth of, His Grace was expected to announce something at the same audit that would settle the future of the house one way or the other before the tenants had so much as finished their dinner. Cora asked, as evenly as she could, what sort of something? Mrs. Pruitt only looked at her sideways and said that a wise woman kept her questions the way she kept her coin, spent only where they'd buy something, and led her on up to the dowager's rooms without another word. Behind them, unnoticed by either, the wren went on singing at the yew hedge as if nothing in the world had yet been decided. Lady Honoria turned out to be small and quick-eyed and entirely too clever to be managed, which suited Cora better than a fool would have. "Sit down, girl," the old woman said. "Before you've even curtsied properly, I can't abide watching people fold themselves in half. It wastes the morning." She tested Cora within the hour, setting 3 columns of figures before her, with a scatter of household bills, and demanding the sum by supper, and Cora had it for her before the tea had cooled, corrected in 2 places where the original clerk had carried a figure wrong. "That," said Lady Honoria, studying her over the rims of her spectacles, "is either very fortunate guessing, or you have kept books before, and I have never in my life met a fortunate guesser who did not also blush, and you have not blushed once." "My husband kept books," Cora said. "I kept house behind him and learned more of it than he knew I had." "He is not living," the old woman said, not as a question. "He is not," Cora said, and offered nothing further. Lady Honoria, who had buried 2 husbands and outlived a great many opinions about grief, had the grace not to press her. It was Julian who pressed, 2 days later, in the estate room, with its long table of ledgers, when he asked her to verify a column of tenant arrears and stood over her shoulder the whole while, as though he expected the figures to rearrange themselves under a dishonest hand. "You may dismiss me the day my sums are wrong, Your Grace," she said at last, without looking up, and not a day before. "I do not require your good opinion, Mrs. Aldridge," he said. "I require your accuracy." "Then we are agreed on terms," she said, and set the pen down exactly parallel to the ledger's edge, a small, precise gesture that would come, in time, to mean a great many things between them, none of which either would name aloud for some months yet. He left the room without another word, which she took, at the time, for coldness, and only later understood for the particular silence of a man who has just discovered he is interested in a woman's competence and does not yet trust himself to say so. Mrs. Pruitt found her still sitting there afterward and said, not unkindly, "You'll want to mind him, that one feels everything and shows nothing. It's a family failing. His father had it before him, and it near killed the old Duke keeping it all in." "And what of you?" Cora asked. "Do you mind him?" "I raised him from a boy who fell off every pony in the stable," Mrs. Pruitt said. "I'll mind him the day he stops needing minding, which will be never. God love him." Cora found herself, unexpectedly, smiling, and said that she herself had come with 1 bag, and could leave with 1 bag, that it was not so very heavy a thing to carry. Being unwanted, she had practiced the carrying of it for 5 years now, and had grown rather good at it. Mrs. Pruitt only sniffed and said that plain women kept the best accounts, on the whole, on account of never being interrupted by their own reflections, and that Cora had best get some sleep. Audit season made devils of everyone in the house before it was through, present company at the top of the list, and she did not say which of them she meant. It was on the 3rd evening that Mr. Edmund Sorrel came to find her, smelling of orange flower water and something sweeter beneath it that did not quite cover the sourness of a long grudge kept warm. He was Julian's cousin and the estate's man of business both, a beautiful, immaculate man who dressed as though cloth cost him nothing, though everyone below stairs knew it had once cost him everything. "Mrs. Aldridge," he said, settling into the chair across from her with the ease of a man who owns every room he sits in. "What a very great pleasure." "I confess I did not look to see that name at Harrowmere again. I did not think it a name anyone here troubled to remember," she said. "Oh, some of us remember a great deal," he said, smiling with all his teeth and none of his eyes. "Your husband's unfortunate business was a sad one. A man ruined by his own hand and dead within the 12-month of the discovery. It does linger in a house's memory, the way certain smells do. I should be careful in your place, going about turning over old ledgers, looking for what he might have hidden there to clear his name. Some things, once turned over, cannot be put back exactly as they were." She held his eye and said nothing, because she had already learned in the small space of 3 days that nothing was the only answer he could not counter. She watched something flicker and settle behind his smile before he rose, bowed with excessive grace, and left her to the sums she had not, in fact, been looking at when he arrived. She noticed, filing it away the way she filed every small thing now, that the column for the home farm's rents in the year of Thomas's disgrace was written in ink, gone a shade darker than the columns on either side of it, as though that single year had been copied out fresh by a different hand at a later date. Below stairs, the servants had already made a wager of it, whether the new companion would last the season, whether His Grace would announce his betrothal to Miss Prentice at the Michaelmas audit, as everyone above the salt seemed to expect. Mrs. Pruitt reported the odds to Cora with the flat relish of a woman who found the whole business faintly ridiculous. 2-1 on the wedding, she said, and 5-1 against you lasting past Michaelmas yourself, though I put my own shilling the other way, for what little that's worth. A cook does not go about betting against her own kitchen, Cora said. No, Mrs. Pruitt agreed. She goes about betting for it, which is a different thing entirely, and rather more use to everyone. The work drew them together before either intended it. Julian took to sitting late in the estate room with the ledgers spread before him, his cravat loosened, ink on his fingers, working through the columns himself in a hand that was neat and hurried both, and Cora, whose own candle burned as late as his most nights, found herself drawn in to help him where the sums grew tangled. It ought not to have been companionable, 2 people bent over the same figures by the same low light while a house slept around them. But it was. He laughed for the first time in her hearing on the 9th night, a short, startled sound he seemed almost to apologize for, when she pointed out that his aunt's dressmaker's bill had been entered twice under 2 different spellings of the same French name, once as though it were a person and once as though it were a debt owed to a small principality. He looked at her for a long moment after the laugh had gone, as though trying to place where he had misfiled her in his own accounts, and said, "You are not what I was told to expect when Lady Honoria's letter arrived." "What were you told to expect?" she asked. "Someone who would need managing," he said. "I find instead I am the one being managed, and rather well, and I cannot decide whether to be aggrieved about it." "You may be aggrieved on your own time, Your Grace," she said. "On mine we are 3 columns from finished." He laughed again, softer, and bent back to the ledger, and did not see the way her own hand was not quite steady on the pen for the length of one whole line. She told him, that night, more of the truth than she had told anyone at Harrowmere. That she had kept a steward's household once, that she understood land and rents and the particular grammar of an estate's accounts the way another woman might understand needlework, that she had not come merely to read novels aloud to his aunt. She did not tell him whose steward she had kept house for. That one card she held back, turning it over and over in the dark of her own room afterward, telling herself she would lay it down when the moment was right, not yet knowing that Edmund Sorel intended there should never be a right moment for it, that he had already begun writing the letter that would take that choice out of her hands entirely. The blow came on a wet gray morning 10 days later, when Julian sent for her to the estate room and did not rise when she entered, which told her before he spoke a single word that whatever was coming, he had already decided it without her. "My cousin tells me," he said, without preamble, "that you kept house for Thomas Aldridge. I do not ask you to deny it, since I understand it to be simple fact. What I ask is why you did not think it worth mentioning that you are the widow of the man my father dismissed from this estate for falsifying its accounts." "I did not think it would recommend me to your notice," she said, which was true, and also nowhere near the whole of it. "Edmund tells me further," Julian said, and here his voice did not rise, but something in it went very still and very cold, "that your husband left considerable debts unaccounted for at his death, and that you have spent 5 years attempting to have his name cleared of a charge that was, by every record this house possesses, entirely just." "I do not know what my husband did or did not do," she said, and her own voice shook now for the first time since she had come through the gates. "I know only that he was a good man who died believing himself ruined, and that I have never in 5 years found a single document that told me why." "Then we are at an impasse," Julian said, "for I have several documents that tell me exactly why, and I begin to wonder whether you came to this house to keep my aunt's accounts or to search my own for something you might use against this family in his memory." She stood very straight and said nothing for a moment, because the accusation had reached in and found the one bruise she had been guarding for 5 years without ever naming it even to herself. The fear that Thomas might, after all, have been guilty, and that her whole quiet campaign of faith had been spent on a lie. "A ledger does not lie," she said finally, "though the hand that keeps it may. I did not come here to prove my husband a saint. I came to find out the truth, whatever it costs me to hear it." Julian looked at her for a long moment, with something unreadable moving behind his grief-worn composure, and said only, "That will be all, Mrs. Aldridge," in a voice gone entirely formal again, and she left the room with her spine held so rigid it ached for an hour afterward. Edmund came to her again 3 evenings later, this time with an offer rather than a threat, which she understood at once to be the same thing wearing gentler clothes. £50, he said, laid the draft upon the table between them without ceremony, and passage to wherever you like, in exchange for a single undertaking that you leave Harrowmere within the week and never again trouble this family with the matter of your husband's accounts. "It is," he said, smiling that warm, terrible smile, "a very great deal of money for a woman in your position to refuse." "It is," she agreed. "I am refusing it all the same." He studied her as though she had said something in a foreign tongue. "You have no proof of anything," he said, more sharply now, the gentleness thinning. "You have 5 years of nothing, and a dead man's disgrace, and a duke who no longer trusts you as far as he could throw his own ledgers. Take the money, Mrs. Aldridge. Pride does not keep a widow warm in winter." "No," she said, "but it is the only thing I have left that is entirely my own, and I find I am not willing to sell it, however cold the winter." She thought, watching him gather up the draft with hands that were not quite as steady as they had been, that she saw for the first time something other than contempt in his face, something nearer to genuine bewilderment at a woman who would not be bought, and she filed that too away without yet understanding its worth. Julian let her go 3 days after that, quietly, through Mrs. Pruitt rather than in person, a note that thanked her for her service and enclosed a month's wages she had not earned and did not want. Cora packed the one bag she had arrived with, folding into it the few things that were entirely hers, and found, working her hand into the lining, to be sure nothing had slipped loose. The small marbled account book Thomas had kept in secret in the last year of his life, sewn once into a false bottom she had forgotten was there, forgotten in the particular way, grief makes a woman forget the objects closest to a wound. She did not open it that night. She left Harrowmere the next morning at first light, the bag in one hand, and she did not look back at the house once, not at the windows, not at the yew hedge where the wren was singing its same indifferent song, not at the study window 3 floors up, where, unknown to her, a folded paper lay, locked in a drawer, bearing her own name in Julian's hand, a settlement he had drawn up with his solicitor before Edmund's poison ever reached him, naming Cora Aldridge his intended Duchess in terms so plain and so binding that his solicitor had asked him twice whether he was entirely in earnest. He had not yet found the courage, or perhaps only the excuse, to burn it, though he told himself daily that he must. She walked 2 miles down the London road before she stopped, in the shade of a hedgerow, to shift the bag's weight, and it was there, sitting on a milestone with the morning already going hot around her, that she finally opened Thomas's little book and found, in his own careful hand, a full year of figures set down twice, once as they had truly stood, and once as they had been entered into the estate's official ledger by a hand that was not his own. The second column false in every particular, and the falsehood traced, unmistakably, patiently, month upon month, to Edmund Sorrel's signature upon the receiving end of every altered sum. She turned back before the church clock in the village had finished striking the hour. It was not triumph she felt, walking the 2 miles again, with the bag heavier now for the truth inside it, but something quieter and harder, the specific grim clarity of a woman who has stopped asking whether a thing is safe and begun asking only whether it is right. She went first to the village and found Toby Yarrow, the underclerk who carried the estate's letters, mending a bridle outside the smithy with his cap pulled low, and she sat beside him and did not accuse him of anything, only laid Thomas's book open on her knee and asked him, quietly, whether he had ever carried a letter for Mr. Sorrel that he had been told not to mention to his grace. Toby turned his cap over twice in his hands before he answered. There were 4 such letters, misses, over as many years, and I never asked what was in them. A man doesn't ask, not when the asking might cost him his place, but I kept the direction of the last one, because it troubled me, and I have it yet, folded in my box at home. Then you will bring it to the magistrate with me, she said, not as a question either. Something in Toby's face loosened with what looked almost like relief at finally being asked to put a 5-year weight down. Mr. Penrose received them within the hour, a spare gray man with a magistrate's patience and a countryman's suspicion of anything too neatly told. And he examined Thomas's book for a long while in silence, before he said that the Michaelmas audit was in 9 days, that every trustee and tenant of consequence would be gathered under one roof already, and that if she meant to bring a charge of this weight, there was no better witness than a room that had not troubled itself to leave. I mean to bring more than a charge, Cora said. I mean to bring the whole of it into the light at once, where a lie cannot stand up straight to be examined. It was a thing Thomas had told her once, in the early easy years of their marriage, that a false sum always looks steady in the dark and always trembles in the light, and she had not thought of it in years until she heard herself say it aloud to a magistrate she had met an hour before. Meanwhile, at Harrowmere, Edmund Sorrel noticed that his ledger of receiving letters had gone missing from its usual drawer, and that Toby Yarrow had not met his eye in 3 days, and though he said nothing of it to anyone, his hands, smoothing his immaculate cuffs in the privacy of his own room that night, would not quite stop their small betraying motion. The audit fell on a bright, hard morning, with a wind moving the last of the summer out of the trees, and the great hall at Harrowmere filled early with trustees down from London, tenants in their good coats, Miss Arabella Prentice pale and correct beside her father, and Edmund presiding over the ledgers laid out on the long table with the easy confidence of a man who has done this 7 years, running and expects an 8th. Julian stood near the hearth with the particular stillness of a man holding a decision he does not wish to make, and it was into that stillness that Cora walked, without her bag, having left it at last at the village inn, needing both hands free, and no longer needing, she found, to keep herself ready to run. The room noticed her before Julian did, a ripple of turned heads and lowered voices, and Edmund's smooth recitation of the year's rents faltered for exactly 1 word before he recovered it. "Your Grace," Cora said, into the pause that followed, "I have a matter that belongs before this audit, and I ask that it be heard before any settlement is announced today." Julian's eyes found hers across the room and held there a long moment, grief and suspicion, and something else entirely moving beneath his composure, and he said, slowly, "Let her be heard," and the room went very quiet to listen. She laid Thomas's book open beside the estate's own ledger for the year of his disgrace, and held both to the window's light so that every trustee might see the 2 columns side by side, the true sum and the false one, and she read them aloud, plainly, without flourish, letting the numbers speak for themselves the way numbers, honestly kept, always, eventually do. Then, Mr. Penrose called Tobiero forward and asked him only one question, quietly, the whole room leaning in to hear it. "Who told you to carry that letter to the 2nd address, Toby, and not the 1st? Just the name." Toby's cap turned once in his hands and stopped. "Mr. Sorrel, sir," he said. It was always Mr. Sorrel, the letter itself, produced and unfolded and read aloud in Edmund's own hand, instructing a bank in a neighboring county to receive certain sums under a name that was not his own, was the thing that broke the room entirely open, gasps and low, furious murmuring rising from the tenants who had paid those very rents in good faith for 5 years running. Edmund Sorrel did not shout and did not run, only stood very straight with his ruined cuffs perfectly smooth, and said, in a voice gone suddenly thin, that he had only ever taken what should have come to him by right, that he had watched a cousin's son inherit everything while he himself had come up poor into this family, and been made to feel it at every turn, that he had wanted, only once, to stop counting what he lacked. It was, Julian said afterward. And everyone in the room seemed to feel the truth of it settle over them like a held breath released, the first entirely honest thing his cousin had said in 5 years, and it changed nothing of the wrong done and everything of how it must be answered. "There will be no charge laid publicly," Julian said, to the visible surprise of half the trustees. "He will have an allowance sufficient to live quietly, and passage to our cousins in the north, and he will not set foot on this estate again while I hold it. I do this not for his sake, but because a public ruin serves no one it touches, least of all this family's name, and I have had enough, this year, of ruined names that did not deserve it." Miss Arabella Prentice, who had stood through the whole of it with her father's hand tight on her arm, stepped forward then and said, quietly but clearly enough for the room, that she withdrew her own family's interest in any settlement discussed for that day, that she had never wished to be married into a debt that was not truly owed, and that she wished Mrs. Aldrich, whom she had never properly met until this morning, considerable joy of whatever came next. Thomas Aldridge's name was cleared before the whole assembled room within the hour, the trustees themselves moving to strike the old charge from the estate's record, and Cora stood at the center of that bright, hard morning, feeling something in her chest unknot that had been knotted 5 years. It was not until the hall had emptied, the tenants gone back to their farms with a year's worth of talk, that Julian found her alone by the same window where she had held the 2 ledgers to the light. You came with one bag, he said, and I let you leave with it, and it is the worst accounting error of my life. I should like to spend the rest of it correcting the sum. She looked at him for a long moment before she trusted her voice. You said once you did not require my good opinion, she said, only my accuracy. I find I require your good opinion after all, Cora, he said. I believe I have required it for rather longer than I have let either of us know. There is a paper in my study, he added, that I drew up before I had the sense to doubt you. And I could not bring myself to burn it even at my most suspicious, which I think tells you rather more of my heart than anything I have said since. Marry me because you wish it, he said. It is the only reason I will take, now that there is no estate left to save and no scandal left to silence, and nothing at all remaining between us but the choosing. She said yes with her hand steady on the windowsill and a wren singing somewhere out past the yew hedge, indifferent as ever to dukes and their ledgers, and it seemed to her, hearing it, the truest blessing the day had offered. The wedding, when it came a month later, was small and quiet by design. A handful of tenants and Lady Honoria weeping open unashamed tears and Mrs. Pruitt weeping harder still while insisting loudly to anyone who would listen that she never cried at weddings. It was only the incense, though there was no incense anywhere in the small gray church. Toby Yarrow was kept on at Harrowmere with a steward's under clerk's wages doubled, and his honesty never again in question by anyone. Mr. Penrose became a friend of the house, and in time something rather warmer to Arabella Prentice, who found in his patient grey manner a partner far better suited to her than any settlement her father had once arranged. Edmund Sorrel wrote once, the following spring, from his cousin's house in the north, a short letter that named no grievance and asked no forgiveness, only reported that the northern air suited him, and that he had taken up, of all things, keeping the local parish accounts, and did them, by every report, with scrupulous and humbled honesty. Thomas Aldridge's name was cut fresh into a new stone that autumn, the old slandering words struck from the estate's records forever. And Cora stood before it once with Julian's hand in hers and told her first husband, quietly, that she had finished the accounts at last and that they came out, in the end, to happiness. A year turned. On a hot, bright morning, very like the one that had begun it all, Cora stood at the gates of Harrowmere again, not arriving this time, but watching a new girl come up the drive with a single bag of her own, plainly dressed, plainly frightened, plainly proud beneath it, and the wren was singing in the same indifferent hedge as though no year at all had passed. Cora did not let her stand unwelcomed at the door. She went down herself to carry the bag the last of the way, and told her, because it seemed the truest thing she owned to give a stranger, that a woman might arrive with one bag and leave a duchess, and never once have planned on either. That the sum of a life was not fixed until the last figure was entered, and that the margins, whatever anyone said, were not always where a woman was obliged to stay. If this story warmed you, if you have ever kept yourself small because it seemed safer than being seen, come sit by the fire a while longer. The kettle is already on, and there is a chair kept for you here every week. Tell me, if you would, which line stayed with you longest, the bag she carried out or the bag she carried back in, and stay close by subscribing so you never miss the next story told by this hearth. Sleep well tonight, and be gentle with the ones who kept your lamp lit long after you stopped believing anyone had noticed it burning.